Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Multiple microphones. I am so thrilled to see so many familiar faces and returning faces. Do we have any first-time visitors to Mount Vernon? Wonderful. We are just with friends. Well, I hope that I can give you some suggestions for maybe your 101st visit if you are getting close to that. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Lindsay Chervinsky. I'm the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. I would like to always thank the Ford Motor Company for their support of this series. It makes it possible for us to bring in scholars from around the country and world to share their work with us and with you. And that's such a thrill to be able to do so and in such a great venue. For tonight's program, a couple of sort of agenda notes, if you will. Our wonderful speaker will start off the evening by giving some remarks to set the stage, and then I will join her and we will have a conversation. Throughout the entire program on this screen down here, there will be a QR code, and that QR code is to ensure that you can be a part of the conversation too. So for those of you who haven't used that system, you can pull up your phone, pull up the camera app, and it will automatically take you to a website where you can enter your questions, which we will get to towards the end to ensure that there is excellent audience participation. A couple of library programs I would like to tell you about that are going to be in the next month or so. Next week on July 2nd, which is the 250th anniversary of Washington arriving in Cambridge, Massachusetts to take command of the Continental Army. He joined the Army on July 3rd, but he arrived on July 2nd. And so we are doing the event on the date. I will be hosting Doctors Ricardo Herrera and Kate LeMay, and we are going to be talking about Washington taking command, the history of the U.S. Army, and how the Army actually served as the first effort at national identity formation. So I think it will be a wonderful conversation. I'm really thrilled to be able to bring it to you. And if you are looking for something cool to do inside in what looks like slightly less ghastly temperatures, but still pretty unpleasant, we hope you will join us. That is, of course, a free event as well. Our next Ford Evening Book Talk will be on July 22nd with Karen Wolf on her new book, Lineage, Genealogy and the Power of Connection in Early America. So I'm sure there's some family historians and genealogists in the audience. We would love to have you return for that story. And then our next lunch at the library will be on July 24th with Lauren S. Molds, who's discussing how artificial intelligence is changing the way we do archival transcription and analysis. Selfishly, we are all excited to learn from him, and I hope you will come learn with us. I think there's a lot of new and interesting information that we are hoping to acquire and bring to our daily work at the library. So now for tonight's speaker, it is such a thrill to be able to introduce you to Dr. Zara Anishanslin, who is both a phenomenal historian and a treasured friend. She is a scholar who specializes in doing history through material culture, or a self-described historian with a thing for things. She is an associate professor of history and art history at the University of Delaware and is passionate about sharing that history and that knowledge with both academic audiences, but especially public audiences, which we here at Mount Vernon believe in quite strongly. You can find her on all sorts of different sort of public history venues, including podcasts and television, things like the Travel Channel's Mystery at the Museum. She writes for public profiles, including the Washington Post, and she is regularly a consultant for museum exhibits for various different types of art installations and galleries, including perhaps most famously the Hamilton the Exhibition, which was done in concert with the musical by Lin-Manuel Miranda. Her first book was called Portrait of a Woman in Silk, Hidden Histories of the British Atlantic World, and is phenomenal. And tonight we are here to discuss her newest book, The Painter's Fire, which, as you can see, has an amazing cover, which I do not say about all books and have very strong opinions about covers. So I am delighted to be able to discuss this book with Zara and with you. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anishanslin.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. It is so exciting for me to be here. This is my first live book talk. The book doesn't officially launch until Tuesday, July 1st. So could not imagine a better venue for this or a better person to be in conversation with than my brilliant friend and amazing scholar, Lindsay Chervinsky. And it's not an exaggeration. I'm not just saying this because I'm at Mount Vernon. This book would not exist without Mount Vernon. So it is also wonderful to be here for that reason. And among other things, this was made possible by a Georgian Papers program fellowship through Mount Vernon, King's College in London, and Windsor Castle. So happy to talk to you in the Q&A about what it's like to research history at Windsor Castle, because among other things, you have to be escorted to the bathroom so that you don't accidentally run into one of their majesties in the castle. So thank you, Mount Vernon, for that experience. I'd like to thank the staff at Mount Vernon, especially the CEO, Douglas Bradburn, Stephen McLeod, who, as always, arranged a beautiful event, and then the curators who take care of the collections here, again, without which this book would not exist, particularly Susan Scholwer, and most particularly Adam Irby, who's been a champion of this book from the start. But last and not least, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out on this abysmally hot day, braving the temperature, the desert of the temperature, to be here tonight. And a special shout out to my friend Amanda from graduate school, who came all the way from San Francisco. So I'm feeling like this is a great night to be in conversation with you all about this book. So, The Painter's Fire, a forgotten history of the artists who championed the American Revolution. Like Lindsay, I agree. I love this cover. I had nothing to do with it, but it's fabulous. And one of the reasons I think it's fabulous is that it allows me to say, and my Gen Z children are horribly embarrassed by this cover is fire. So, thank you to the designer who made this happen. But so before Lindsay and I talk about the book, I want to give you a little bit of a big picture overview of what's in the book, and then spend some time giving a snapshot of some of the key historical figures and how they relate to Mount Vernon. But mostly, I want to give you a chance to see some of the art that I'm going to be talking about. But somewhat perversely, I'm going to start with art that you can't see because it was probably lost at sea. And I'm going to start talking about the history of the American Revolution, not in Boston or Virginia or Philadelphia, but in London, and more precisely at London's Royal Academy of Art. So picture the scene. This is what the Royal Academy looked like a couple decades after what I'm describing, but the innards of the scene are the same. Royal Academy of Arts in London, 1780, crowded with pictures, as you can see, including brand new portraits of King George and Queen Charlotte by Benjamin West. There also was a debut painting by 22-year-old Joseph Wright, a promising award-winning Royal Academy student, notable for being one of the first Americans to study there. And many of you might know Joseph Wright, or this will sound familiar to you because his works hang at Mount Vernon, including a bust portrait that he did of Washington. But he hadn't made it to that point yet. This is his very first show, his very first painting on display. This was his first splash. And although his painting was just one of the many portraits in the show, it was one of the most widely remarked upon. And it was a portrait of his famous mother, American wax sculptor Patience Wright, whom you see there in a portrait on the left. And she was in his portrait, much as she is here, modeling a head on her lap, but she was doing so while two busts looked on. And the busts were those of King George and Queen Charlotte, whose portrait you see on the right. And the head that she was modeling on her lap in her son's portrait was the decapitated head of King Charles I, England's king, famously decapitated by his own subjects during the English Civil War. So in other words, it's saying, hey, George and Charlotte, this could happen to you too. It was, as everyone knew, a portrait of regicide, and it created a sensation, but reactions to the portrait varied widely. And this is interesting in part because this is 1780, 5 years into the war. Some called it an insult to decency, even treasonous. And here you see Joseph Wright, soon after published a portrait of himself as Yankee Doodle or the American Satan, which I think gives you an insight into how he was being treated after this portrait. But even though some said it was treasonous, others saluted it as an entertaining defense of constitutional liberties. So the clashing opinions and the remarkable presence of it at London's Royal Academy reminds us that the war we now call the American Revolution was fought on both sides of the Atlantic, by artists as well as soldiers, and in the courts of public opinion as well as on battlefields. But art, like many things, does not always survive the havoc of history, as this black screen reminds us. What's preserved in our museums is only a very small part of what was once created and seen. Wright's picture of his mother, for example, survives only in archival documentation like the letters and newspapers I just quoted to you. The portrait itself must be imagined, for it cannot be seen. It likely, as I mentioned, was lost at sea. In 1781, Joseph Wright left London for Paris for understandable reasons. He was not getting a lot of commissions. And then in 1782, with the help of the Wright's family friend, Benjamin Franklin, he made plans to return to the United States, sailing on a Boston-bound ship. After a 10-week journey, battling gusts of snow-filled wind at its last day of sea, the ship approached the Maine coast and ran aground on a pile of rocks. Although the passengers managed to make it ashore, much of the ship's cargo, including Wright's paintings, were lost, washed out of the ship's hold, or sunk below the waves. So Joseph Wright's portrait of his mother holding the decapitated head of Charles I may have sunk under the Atlantic near the coast of Maine. But though it is physically lost, it offers an invaluable window into the revolutionary past. So much as we can dive to retrieve shipwrecked things from the bottom of the sea, we can tell histories that allow us to see previously submerged stories about the past. Just because they're submerged or hidden does not mean they're not there. And in The Painter's Fire, I bring these revolutionary portraits up from the depths of the past and into the light. This allows us to see a new transatlantic history of the American Revolution and the creative people who made it, one that transforms the way we think of the nature of patriotism, then and now. And this art and these artists are important to this story because the American Revolution was not only fought in the colonies with muskets and bayonets. On both sides of the Atlantic, artists armed with paint, canvas, and wax played an integral role in forging revolutionary ideals. From London to Boston, from Jamaica to Paris, from Bath to Philadelphia, these largely forgotten patriots boldly risked their reputations and their lives to declare independence. So at the center of The Painter's Fire are the lives of these three of these remarkable artists devoted to the pursuit of liberty: Robert Edge Pine, Prince Demah, and Joseph Wright's mother, Patience. And here you see samples of their work. On the left, a portrait of a Boston merchant by Prince Demah. In the middle, one of Patience Wright's, the only one of her surviving full-length wax sculptures in Westminster Abbey of William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham. And on the right, you see Robert Edge Pine's portrait of George Washington, which those of you who know your portraits of George Washington will see this looks a little different than some of the other portraits of George Washington. And in part because of who these artists were, women, men of color enslaved and free, and Britons living in England, these patriot artists were mostly excluded from formal political or military power. Instead, they fired salvos against the king on the walls of the Royal Academy, as well as on the battlefields of North America. They used their talents to inspire rebellion, define American patriotism, and eventually fashion a new political culture, often alongside more familiar revolutionary figures like Ben Franklin and Phyllis Wheatley. And together, the story of their lives testified to both the promise and the limits of liberty in the founding era. So a little snapshot look at each of them. So here you see Prince Demah, his work. So Prince Demah was the first identifiable enslaved portrait painter in America. And he went to study in London with Robert Edge Pine. And after he studied in London, he came back to America, self-emancipated when his loyalist enslavers fled the country after, among other things, a horse was tarred and feathered as a way to scare them away from Massachusetts. And he eventually enlisted in a militia of Massachusetts in which Paul Revere was the second in command. So this is a sample of some of his work. He's this remarkable enslaved man who managed to travel to London to train, picks up arms to fight for the American Revolution, and then dies too young in 1778. But these are some of the things he creates. A portrait of William Duguid, Scottish merchant living in Boston, which is hanging out at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and is remarkable, among other things, for the fact that he signed it on the back, and that's an image of his signature there, with the fancy Latin phrase, showing his cosmopolitan knowledge of the world. And then in the middle there is the actual brooch, the heart-shaped garnet brooch that Dogood wears in his portrait. And that you can also see at the Met. And the reason I think that's so important is something that survives the ravages of time, right? But also, this family loved that portrait and they saved that brooch and they saved them together to make a point. So they didn't care that this was an enslaved man painting the portrait, or formerly enslaved man. A man who, by the way, John Singleton Copley of Boston, refused to train because he was Black, which is how Prince Demah ended up in London in the first place. But so I love this, that you see this centuries-long attachment to this man as an artist. And then on the bottom right is a portrait of his enslaver, Christian Barnes, who was also weirdly his art patron. It was her idea to send him to London. And those of you looking at it, you'll see that there's a gash in her chest. You're not imagining things. That is a hole in the painting, because when Patriot troops came to commandeer the Barnes' house when they fled to England, they commandeered it. They gave it over to General Henry Knox and his wife Lucy for their use. And they put a bayonet through the heart of her portrait to symbolize the hatred of the loyalist Barneses, as if the tarring and feathering of the horse wasn't enough, right? So this is Prince Demah. And among other things, I think he painted his neighbor on King Street in Boston, Phyllis Wheatley. So in the past, this has been attributed to an artist whose works are completely unknown and only saluted in a poem that Phyllis Wheatley wrote, which, by the way, is the inspiration for the title of my book, The Painter's Fire. And I think, though, is Prince Demah, and I could get into that in the Q&A if anyone's interested. And in part, it was because Prince Demah at this point was advertising himself as a Black man whose extraordinary genius has been assisted by one of the best masters in London, in Boston. And so I always wonder if Prince Demah corresponded with his teacher in London, Robert Edge Pine. And I don't know, because he didn't leave much documentation behind. As I mentioned, he died in 1778. He did leave behind a will in which he left everything he had to, as he called her, my beloved mother, Daphne, who was an enslaved woman stolen from Africa as a child. And he proudly proclaimed himself to be a free man and a painter. And I love that. He establishes his identity with his last moments. One of the reasons I wonder if he corresponded with Robert Edge Pine, his teacher, was that Robert Edge Pine was quite the egalitarian Republican little r himself. So Robert Edge Pine, British artist, born in Britain, lived in Britain until he emigrated here after the American Revolution. By the time Prince Demah came to study with him, he'd painted famous people who also happened to be friends to the American patriot cause. British historian Catherine Sawbridge Macaulay, who you see there on the left, with a very symbolically loaded painting, lots of references to ancient Rome and republics, just so you know where she stands politically. The 18th century is not subtle, right? So you get this. And then on the right, his portrait of John Wilkes, who's a famous sort of, poster child for liberty in 18th century, the British Empire. So Pine was Republican, egalitarian, kind of feisty, apparently very short. He also was likely of African descent. This is his father, John Pine. And John Pine was one of William Hogarth's best friend, a fellow Mason in his Masonic temple in London, which widely acknowledges that he is of African descent. Now, we only have visual evidence for this, but the evidence is pretty clear. And again, I can go into some of the signals that they're sending through this portrait. So during the war, Robert Edge Pine's work suffered, in part because he created images like this. This is called America. Too complicated to go into this iconography in this brief introduction I'm giving, but trust me, it's very pro-American, very not pro-Britain. This is in 1778, sort of makes him persona non grata, much as Joseph Wright's portrait of the decapitated head of Charles I made him persona non grata. And to drum up support for this print being made, which eagle eyes will have noticed is familiar because it hangs today in the small green dining room at Mount Vernon. To drum up support, he raised subscriptions. So basically saying, people give me money so I can make this painting/print happen. One of the most enthusiastic supporter of this was George William Fairfax of Virginia, who had become friends with Robert Edge Pine in Bath, England, where they both lived. George William Fairfax was so enthusiastic, he signed it to buy 5 copies. One of which, and you see the information about that from a beautiful item that Mount Vernon has in its collections here at the library. And one of those copies is the copy that hangs today in Mount Vernon's dining room. So in England, one of the family friends who was really important to Robert Edge Pine was Patience Wright, the mother of Joseph Wright, who opened this little vignette that I'm giving you here today. And her portrait there on the left is actually by Robert Edge Pine, who I've just been talking about. And among the things that she made were not just the portrait of William Pitt in wax. So think of her as Madame Tussauds before Madame Tussauds. But she also did bust portraits, like the one that you see of Washington there, which is either done by her or her daughter, who's also a wax sculptor. But so one reason that incendiary portrait Joseph Wright did of the decapitated head of Charles I made such a splash was that everyone knew what his mother looked like. Her image was in magazines. She ran this popular museum in the middle of London. And she also had this sensationalist technique of making wax sculptures. I don't think this is always how she did her work, but she was a real impresario. She knew how to do this. She would call people over to have their portrait done. She would put a wax model under her skirts, and she would be molding it while she talked to them. And then she would whip it out, and there it would be. Again, anyone who's done art knows this is probably not the way this happened. She probably had it, sort of pre-made and like little pressing a couple things. But, so this is part of why she's sensational. And so she's this famous person. And she, like Robert Edge Pine and Prince Demah, is an avid American patriot. So once fighting broke out in 1775, she switched up what was in her wax museum to make a pro-American statement. And she also became very active helping American prisoners of war who were kept in places from the Tower of London to abysmal prisons in Plymouth, where they were eating snails out of cracks in the walls to survive. She also was a spy. And she would send letters about British troop movements and government plans in wax heads that she created and shipped across the Atlantic to her sister, Rachel, who operated a wax museum in Philadelphia, frequented by the Continental Congress. John Adams wrote about going and said it was really discomforting because it was like walking among corpses. He did not like it. She also really wanted to be something bigger than most women were allowed to be in the Revolution. So much as Abigail Adams exhorted her husband to remember the ladies, you'll see here in this letter to John Dickinson, she says, please call on me for espionage and other things because women are always useful in grand events. So she has a good sense, an inflated sense of self. So she also had big plans for what she wanted to do after the war. She wanted to move back to Philadelphia and make wax figures of important founders like Washington. In fact, she envisioned making an entire collection of wax figures of distinguished founders to display in the State House, now Independence Hall. She was motivated by animosity toward the king as well as her own patriotism, and she wrote to Jefferson that, quote, "The more public the honors bestowed upon such men by their country, the better. To shame the English king, I would go to any trouble and expense. To add my mite in the stock of honor due to Adams, Jefferson, and others." So in other words, she understood the symbolic and instructive importance of art and its political power. And she wanted to use art to influence how the world pictured the new United States. So she began planning to move back to America, but her plans never came to fruition. In the spring of 1786, she died in London after a fall returning from a visit to John Adams, no doubt to badger him about returning back to America to make this wax museum. So at the time of her death, Robert Edge Pine was in America, busy collecting portraits of these same men to include in the grand history paintings he planned to make to commemorate the American Revolution. And he was also painting a lot of portraits. And here you see some of them. In Mount Vernon, the pictures of the Custis grandchildren in the Washington's bedroom, the aforementioned picture of George Washington, the top right there, picture of Martha Washington's niece, Fanny, which is a beautiful portrait in the front parlor. So one of the ways he was able to make so many portraits was that his daughters would help him with this. So he would go and he would paint the head, when someone was sitting in front of him, and then he would take the cutout head and paste it onto a canvas. And then his daughters, like his daughter Charlotte Pine, who you see here, would finish out the surrounding portraits. No one else does this. This is a weird technique, but it's highly effective in terms of producing a lot of portraits. And even though, we might look at his portraits today and be like, well, that's not as great as like a Copley portrait, aesthetically speaking. But I will say, compared to some other portraitists of the day, even Robert Edge Pine in his worst day was better than John Wollaston at painting children. So, on the left, Robert Edge Pine, Elizabeth Parke Custis, eventually Law. On the right, John Wollaston, Custis children. I don't need to say anything else. But what Pine really wanted to do, like Patience Wright, was chronicle the big histories of the American Revolution. And he also operated America's first big art museum in Philadelphia. Sorry, Charles Wilson Peale, but it's true. So most of his history paintings, like most of Wright's wax figures, were destroyed in fire in the 19th century. But one survives in a copy, and here you see Congress voting independence. And it offers a much more realistic, less romanticized depiction of the event and its architectural setting in particular than Trumbull's more famous later version, for example. So I like to say that Trumbull's is the sort of photoshopped version, and Pine's is there's no filter. But so imagine how our understanding of the revolution and its patriots might have altered had more of his art survived, and had he, Patience Wright, and Prince Demah continued to keep making art long after the war ended. We would have a gallery of lifelike colored wax figures of founders to rival Madame Tussauds, portraits by a formerly enslaved man who was also, like Trumbull, a London-trained patriot artist and military veteran. The art of Wright, Pine, and Demah would have created a different visual memory of the American Revolution. So in the end, the intertwined lives of the patriots in this book remind us that the popular image of a patriot in the American Revolution, of a white man writing a political pamphlet or leading a battle charge within the continental United States, tells only part of the story. Revolutionary era patriotism was far more cosmopolitan, geographically broad, and diverse than it is often remembered to be. The patriots who dedicated themselves to the cause of American liberty included Black and mixed-race people, women, people from outside what became the national borders of the United States, and people who practiced idiosyncratic politics outside the bounds of elected office through art, popular culture, and espionage. Folding the transatlantic story of these creative patriots into the wider one of the nation's origins both complicates and enriches it. And as we approach the nation's 250th birthday in 2026, the lives traced in this book remind us that we must continue to revise our collective memory about who American patriots were, what they looked like, where they fought, and with what weapons. We must seek to reimagine what patriotism meant during the American Revolution, how important art was to its development, and what that might mean for how we understand it today. Doing so helps us better understand their world, but also points to places and things that allow us to have the historical conversation that can move us forward together as a diverse nation. Places and things like those Mount Vernon collects and preserves. So thank you so much, and I'm so looking forward to the conversation with you and Lindsay. Yes. Rug. Chairs.
Chairs forward a little bit. Let's see if I can do this without spilling.
Nicely done.
Okay. Got to have our prop here. Wow, you set us up on such a great foundation for this conversation. I'm really captured by this idea that you have in the book, and you are, concluding with at the end that this is a very different type of patriotism, and it changes how we think about patriotism. I'd wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that, about how it changes what we think of a patriot, how we should think about a patriot, and what it means to sort of adopt that as a descriptor, as they so intentionally did.
That's a great question. And I think it reminds us, and the epilogue of the book goes into this a bit. Patience Wright's sister, who helped her in the espionage, wrote to Benjamin Franklin. And it's interesting because she did so once under her name and then once not, in an anonymous letter in the same handwriting and the same references. So it's a little strange. But she says, I want to have money to bring my sister's body back from London to bury her in American soil because she was a patriot and this meant so much to her. And she said, Tom Paine has recently been given land. We've remembered a Thomas Paine. Why can't we remember a Patience Wright? And it's a really interesting point because no one would say that Patience Wright's fairly ineffectual espionage. One of my favorite letters was at the British Library, British government officials writing, yes, we took Patience Wright's letters again to Benjamin Franklin. We're letting them go through because some of her information is just wrong. So it might, do better to have it go through. But she is actively working on behalf of things. So she's not having the same impact as Thomas Paine's Common Sense by any stretch of the imagination, but she's doing things that women can do, and she's doing things in the heart of enemy territory in London, under the king's nose, as it were. So I think it reminds us that, and then people like Prince Demah, who, as a Black man formerly enslaved, is never going to be given command of an army, is never going to be invited to sit in Continental Congress, but he does what he can too. And so I think it reminds us that patriotism should not be limited to military exploits and traditional formal political power. And I think that's an important message for those of us who are still living in the fruition of their fight, which is the American Republic, and the reminder that it requires patriotic action on all citizens, great and small.
Hear, hear. So one of the things, you talk about, this art wouldn't be important if public opinion was not something that people had to factor in on both sides of the Atlantic. So what is, you describe art as a weapon in the field of public opinion. Why does a public opinion matter in this moment, and how did art shape it?
I think the fact that Joseph Wright's painting of the decapitated head his mother was holding had such diverse reactions is very telling about this. So when I came across the description of this painting in the catalog of the Royal Exhibition, I was like, wait, what? This is 1780, and King George and Queen Charlotte, by the way, their portraits weren't just there, they were physically there, because it was the first year that this academy opened in its new home, which they had helped fund with their largesse. And I was like, well, surely this is a one-off, and all the newspapers and responses are going to be very anti this incendiary American painting, when in fact it was pretty evenly divided. And so that made me think, this is never a war that's universally popular on either side of the Atlantic. We've done a lot of scholarship now reminding us that people like Henry and Christian Barnes, loyalists, they're not a tiny minority, and they matter to the history of the American Revolution. Similarly, people on the other side of the Atlantic, some of them never want the American war to happen, as they call it. They think it's shameful that the mother country is fighting its colonists. And the fact that this portrait does get support 5 years after the fighting has begun, I think really points to that. So thinking about those divisions and the reminder that it's boring, and historians always say this, but it's because it's true, that history's complicated.
Well, I love that you make that point, because so often we talk, or I shouldn't say so often, in the last couple of decades, historians have really talked about the connections between loyalists in North America and sort of the loyalist diaspora, what they did afterwards, where they went. Of course, Benedict Arnold becomes a very famous example of that, but he's just one of many. We don't usually do that with the patriot ties. Mm-hmm. And I think that's such an important contribution that you make. And I wonder how it changed your conception of what the revolution was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had no idea of the depth of American support in the UK before I started this. And I will say, one of the things when I was researching at Windsor Castle, and also through something called the Addingham Summer School, which takes you around stately homes in Britain for 3 weeks to look at the contents of their art and architecture.
Sounds terrible.
It was awful, but someone has to do it, so I volunteered. So in both instances, I was going on the trail of Robert Edge Pine in particular, but also Patience Wright in London, because among other things, this is why these people are like wackadoodle and amazing, and wackadoodle is a very serious historical word.
It's a term of science.
But Patience Wright's, one of her daughters marries a Royal Academy artist who, among other things, is rumored to be an illegitimate son of George III. So, the craziness just doesn't stop. But so I went on the trail of these people, and when I was in Windsor Castle and then in the stately homes, and initially I was thinking, okay, Patience Wright, I buy that she's a big patriot, right? She's an American who's moved to London. I wasn't so sure about Robert Edge Pine. I was like, he probably comes here because George William Fairfax was like, you can make some money in America. I'll send you out with a letter of introduction to George Washington, which he does. But then I started reading letters from Robert Edge Pine, and there was one instance where he was an elected official of the Society of Artists, which is this sort of parallel group to the Royal Academy of Art. And a lot of those artists refused to join the Royal Academy because it was too royal and too aristocratic. And Robert H. Pine one time was an elected official of that counter group. And he thought the president was being unegalitarian. So he resigned in protest. But then he read the bylaws and he saw you could only resign and be voted by the membership. So he reinstated himself so that he could then be voted out. So, this is a man who's completely devoted to the egalitarian process. And as I was touring these stately homes and I was reading the papers of the king and queen and other royal family members and aristocrats, I was like, yeah, if you are devoted to the cause of egalitarianism, you really don't want to be in England in the 1770s and 80s. Like, of course, America makes sense to you. So I feel like it also opened my eyes in terms of what the American Revolution meant to people, not just in America, but around the world, which really helped me think differently and in newly inspiring ways about why the American Revolution reverberated around the globe and continues to reverberate, I think.
That's so true. I think the idea and the potential of what it could be was, has never been perfectly achieved, but continues to inspire in ways that are sometimes hard to quantify, but for individuals meant everything. So one of the things I love about your work is you find these people who, for all intensive purposes, appear to have no real connection with each other initially on the page. And then you find these incredible Forrest Gump-like stories where they somehow weave and merge. And you did this wonderfully with your first book. And in the first book, it's actually like a dress that weaves and ties. So how did you find these people? How did they become your subjects? And then how did you discover that they crossed paths in such fascinating ways?
So I think at this point, I'm a one-trick pony. I'm a historian who is inspired by a visit to a museum and then decides to write a book. Because that's what I did with my first book. It's what I did with my second book. And it's probably what I'm doing with the third book. So I guess it is what it is. So I was with a group of history students. I was teaching at the City University of New York at the time at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in their American wing. And, I was there to show them history, paintings, and how art should be considered a historical source, but also to be attentive to the myth making that's happening. And I'm sure many of you have been there, right? And the marquee painting is Washington crossing the Delaware, right? That enormous 19th century painting, which is not historically accurate, among other things. No one's standing up in the bow of a ship crossing a river. Like, that's not a good idea. So, but, your eye is drawn to these things and to these celebratory portraits. So the portrait of William Duguid, the Scottish merchant wearing the heart-shaped brooch that I show you, is also in that gallery. But it's tucked away on another wall. And it's kind of way down, and it's this relatively small portrait. And so I went up and I was looking at it. I was like, this portrait is wild. Like, I haven't seen this before. This was 2015, just so you know how long history books can take sometimes. And I was looking at it and I read the story attached to it. And I was like, this is like a movie. Like, this is an enslaved man who goes to London to train. And then he comes back and he self-emancipates and he fights for the patriots. And then he sadly dies. And then I noticed that the brooch was there. And I was like, wow, as I mentioned in my remarks before, I was like, someone really loved these two things to keep them together. And so I thought, this is so cool. And thinking about extending the story of Robert H. Pine and Prince Demah together, because I always like a transatlantic story, because I think it's important, but also I like to go to London to research. And then I was like, women are always half of history. I need to remember the ladies. I need a third pivotal artist, and she needs to be a woman.
They are useful in grand events.
They're useful in grand events and history books too.
Yes, indeed.
And so, I discovered then that Patience Wright does have these organic, natural connections to Robert H. Pine, for example. When her daughter marries George III's supposed illegitimate son, one of the two witnesses to the marriage is Robert H. Pine's niece. So once I realized they're all organically connected socially, politically, as well as artistically, it seemed to me that it was a natural network to pursue. And then there's the happy coincidence of, you've got Paul Revere, George and Martha Washington, John and Abigail Adams, Thomas Jefferson, all these people that we're really familiar with. And what I liked about this is I don't think anyone is saying, let's not look at the Washingtons, let's not look at Jefferson, let's not look at the Adams. I think what I want to say is they lived in a world that was populated by William Lee and Patience Wright and Prince Demah. And why not make their story as full and rich and diverse as it was when it was unfolding? So part of it was me making these connections through the documentation and the art, and part of it was wanting to naturally expand these networks to reflect the real diverse population of the time.
So I have a couple more questions, but just a reminder, if you have some of yours, feel free to enter them in. I will bring up the fancy iPad in a moment, and so wanted to give you that reminder. You know, you talked about the painting inspiring the story, but I would love if you could share with us a source that perhaps was unexpected or one of your favorite secret finds. I think those archival discoveries are always so great to be able to share.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've talked a lot about the Joseph Wright head portrait. That is definitely one, because that was just mind-boggling. One of my other favorites is a letter that Patience Wright wrote to Benjamin Franklin when he was in Paris. You know, so 1778, he's there negotiating the Franco-American alliance. And she writes to him and she says, I have raised 500 men who are willing to march through the streets of London and help to overthrow George III. And my friend, this guy named Peter Labilliere, who helps her in the Wax Museum and is also this former British Marine veteran who, among other things, when he dies, says, bury me upside down so when the second coming of Christ happens, I'll have a head start when the world is topsy-turvy. So this is what I'm saying. These people, like, you can't make this stuff up. So he, according to her, has raised 700 of his military veteran friends. And she says, Franklin, if you can come to London, we have 1,200 men willing to march through the streets of London, depose and imprison George III, but you have to come because we want to put you in his place on the throne. And I was reading this letter going, are you kidding me? Like, this is like, I'd never seen anyone talk about this. It's readily accessible. This was something I found on Founders Archive, you know, so it's been digitized. But just the reminder that one of the things I loved about researching these people and these events is it reminds me so powerfully of the revolution that never was. So on two levels. One is the revolution of these, again, I'm going to use the word wackadoodle, plots, for example, that never come to fruition. But the other is that, in a more serious sense, people like Patience Wright, people like Prince Demah, they're trying to assert the fact that they are useful in these grand events, that they do have a role to play. And yet, for so long, the United States of America did not include them in the promise that all men are created equal. And so I think that also is a reminder that the revolution is still an ongoing process. And so, you know, that single archival document reminded me of that fact that, you know, this is still an unfolding event. And I don't know, I also want to think about King Benjamin Franklin. It's just wild.
Were there any, you know, historians are obviously limited by the sources that we have and what survives and what we can surmise from what survives. So I love to take any opportunity of speaking to a public audience to discuss the question that I couldn't answer in the hopes that they might have an answer for me, because I'm trying to find this thing that I can't find. What question most annoys you that you weren't able to answer?
Oh, that's a hard one, because as you know, there's always a frustration. I think one of the most frustrating questions to me is that there is this gap in Prince Demah's life between when he makes the surviving portraits, which are only a handful, and then he writes his will in 1778. And then in between, I have little scatterings of evidence when he enlists in the Massachusetts militia, he's in the roster, you know, and you can trace things about his life then. But thinking about what his life was like in the sort of 4 missing years, I think is really tantalizing and sad, because one of the reasons that I love thinking about Prince Demah is that, in tandem with Phyllis Wheatley, who's also a key figure in this book, is that they live, when Prince Demah comes back from London, he sets up shop painting in Boston on King Street, about a block away from where Phyllis Wheatley lives with the Wheatleys. So think about that. There are not one but 2 enslaved geniuses, as they were thought of at the day, creative geniuses, living basically on the same block in Boston. And the reason I find that so compelling is that I think it reminds us that people like Prince Demah and Phyllis Wheatley were extraordinary, but they were not unique. And I think that it does the history of women, the history of Black people, a disservice to say that these are these exceptional people, when in fact there were many exceptional people. And, you know, we have a lot of information about Phyllis Wheatley and her life in those years, and it kills me that we don't have the same amount of information for Prince Demah and his life in those intervening years. So I have seen a couple of paintings I think are his that I want to go see. But yeah, so that to me is the big.
Well, and for those of you who don't know, Boston at that time was teeny
Yeah.
tiny. So the likelihood that they wouldn't have met is like almost zero.
Right.
Because of how intensely packed in people were into that community. That's such an incredible thing to try and envision. I'd love to go back and walk around Boston just for a day. Don't want to live there. Very happy with modern healthcare and, you know, being able to wear pants. But
yes, indoor plumbing.
It would be, just for like a day, just to see what it's like. It'd be so cool. Okay, so we have some fantastic questions. Milan Yeager, I hope I said that correctly, wants to know how British artist depictions of the revolutionary battles, and I'm going to say the revolution more broadly, differs from American artist depictions.
Oh, that's so interesting. And it's kind of a tricky distinction to make, because some of the American artists who go on to paint the battles depictions that you would think of, so like a John Trumbull, for example, are trained in London. And so it's really hard to dissect what is American and what is British at this point in time, which is another reason I wanted to write this book, was to show that the Atlantic should be seen as a bridge, not a barrier, and to think of the American Revolution as happening just on the, you know, eastern seaboard of the United States is not correct, right? It was a much broader conflict culturally as well as militarily speaking. But what I do think is interesting is if you look at the more what many people would call folk artists, so, you know, like the depictions of like the Battle of Lexington and Concord, that are done by American artists who have never left America, those do look very different than the paintings that are done by some of the British artists who are painting things on the other side. But I would say that contrasting, it's not of a battle, obviously, unless, you know, you want to think about Congress battling the vote for declaring independence. But the contrasting image of Robert Edge Pine and John Trumbull, that to me is a really interesting instance, because Trumbull's painting actually is more in a sort of proper classically British style, whereas Robert Edge Pine's is more of what we think of as realism, and not like the big history paintings that he's doing when he lives in London. So in a weird way, when he comes to America, he sort of becomes more like the American folk artist than, you know, so more realistic. And so, yeah, it's a very intriguing flip. But, you know, the big takeaway is that from an art historical as well as a historical perspective, it's really hard to make any clear distinctions at this point.
That is a really interesting takeaway. So there are a couple questions here of people that want to know more how you got your start, how you became first interested in your thing for things, you know, how you started your career, and then what your research methodology looks like. How do you go about researching a book like this?
Other than going to museums, like, what sings to me? So I got into this because when I was little, my grandmother used to drag me around to see our Revolutionary War ancestors' tombstones. I know it sounds like a really good time. But so I got really intrigued by the idea that I could look at this thing and it would evoke in me a sense of the past, and thinking about what that meant. And then at the same time, I'm sounding like the really just like dorkiest child here. I would also go with my grandfather to his Air Force reunions for World War II. And I loved hearing all the stories. But then I got really annoyed because at a certain point they made the women and children leave so they could talk about things, I mean, understandably, like the Bataan Death March, and they didn't want us to hear about it. But I was like, I want to hear all the stories. And I was like, and I want to hear the stories that come from the things. And so that was really where I got inspired to think about that. And I was also a literature major in college, but I realized that you can't make up better stories than history gives us. So, you know, I think that was where I started. But in terms of my methodology, it really is thinking about, most historians pay so much attention to documents, and obviously you can tell from what I've said tonight, I pay attention to documents too. But I think we're still not quite caught up to a place where historians take material objects and things and paintings as seriously as historical evidence as they do archival work. And so I've really made that sort of my mission, is to tell these stories that would otherwise be hidden, of these inspiring people through the things that are left behind. And sometimes the things that aren't left behind, but we know existed.
Yes, absolutely. I'm on the search for one of them. Can't find the damn sword. Pardon my language. Richard Gamble has a great question, which is that you mentioned that Pine had 6 daughters and 2 of them served as his assistants. Mm-hmm. Did the daughters continue to paint after he died, and do any of their paintings survive?
Yes, and actually this is a part 2 for the audience that you might be able to chime in on. So at least 2 of them, I don't know, I think more than 2 of them might have helped him with the paintings, actually. But two of them went on, after he died in the 1780s, which I think Charles Wilson Peel was glad about because then he had no competition in Philadelphia. But when he died, his wife, who also was a portrait painter, but we have none of her art that survives, she started a boarding school for girls, among whose students were Benjamin Franklin's granddaughter, Thomas Jefferson's younger daughter. So, these are like well-connected people. And her daughters helped her teaching in the school. But at a certain point, they decided it wasn't financially viable to stay in Philadelphia anymore. So they put all the art and the museum space itself. This, by the way, they lived in a house that was bespoke, built for them by Robert Morris, the famous financier. The entire second floor was a gallery that was a museum. Nothing like this had existed in America before. So they put the house up for auction. Pennsylvania, the state government, wanted to raise money so that the art wouldn't leave America because they felt it was the foundation of a national, sort of like a Smithsonian prototype. But so she put it up for auction. They don't take any of it with them. They go to England, and two of the daughters end up exhibiting in the Royal Academy. And it's very tantalizing because I've found their names in the exhibition catalogs for the 1790s, but I don't know anything else about them. And I've tried, and I cannot find a trace of them in the documentation afterwards. But at least one of them was exhibiting miniatures, so she was a miniature painter.
That is tantalizing. Fascinating. Maybe something will come up, and there will be another.
Miss J. Pine.
Yeah,
Jane.
There we go. Love that. Gary would like to know if there are any other artists that you came across in your research that aren't necessarily the main three we're talking about that you think really deserve additional attention.
Oh, a great question too. So there is a person, I think his name is Dalrymple. I think I'm remembering that correctly. He's a miniaturist as well. And he's fighting for the British, but then he deserts the British military, enlists in the same militia that Prince Demah is enlisted in. And then he deserts that. He resigns his commission because, and he writes a letter to Washington actually about it and says, I feel like I'm in too much danger because if I'm captured in battle, I will be tried as a traitor because I didn't resign my commission. I just deserted the British Army. So he's like, I don't feel like I can continue to do this. Anyway, he's a miniaturist. And there are a few examples. One of his miniatures, for example, survives at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I would love to know more about him. And I think it's so intriguing that he's in this Massachusetts militia. Prince Demah's in this Massachusetts militia. Paul Revere's in this Massachusetts militia.
This is another Forrest Gump story.
Yes, it's basically all of these men. And so, I love to think about, he's a really fascinating example of someone who changes loyalties, but is also doing art during the Revolution. So I think he's a great example. And obviously the Pine Daughters. Like, I really want to know more about the Pine Daughters.
Sean would like to know, what is one of the weirdest places you've conducted research? He said off the beaten path, but we should say wackadoodle.
Wackadoodle.
Use your scientific term.
Wackadoodle Windsor Castle. No, I don't know.
It is a little nuts.
It is a little nuts, but not off the beaten path. So
correct. Yeah.
That's such a great question too. I will say it was probably for my first book. So for this one, it was much more mainstream stuff. But for my first book, I went to research at the Guild of Apothecaries in London, have a research hall in the middle of Chelsea Physic Garden. If anyone's ever been there, it's still an operating botanical garden on this side of the River Thames. And they have this amazing little archive, and it's filled with 18th century plant samples and 18th century prayer books. And they were just like, yeah, go in there and do whatever. And I was like, what? And they just left me in this tiny room in the Chelsea Physic Garden by myself to do whatever I wanted. And that's not normal at all.
No.
So, but it was really fun.
That sounds
And I didn't
amazing.
steal anything.
So if you feel comfortable, I would love to know what's next for you.
Well, I have been visiting some museums, so I have another project.
Perfect.
So my next project that I'm thinking of, and I've just done a tiny bit of research, is a history that's grounded in Nantucket, but goes down to Alexandria, Virginia, and across the Atlantic to France. And yes, I may or may not have chosen this story because of the places I would have to go to research again. But it's a story of two children who were born on opposite sides of the world in very different conditions of slavery and freedom, who end up together in Nantucket. And their portraits are hanging very next to each other in the Whaling Museum in Nantucket. And thinking about how their portraits are together in the museum and their lives intersect in a really fascinating way in the 1820s when a slave catcher comes from Virginia to Nantucket to try to capture this man and bring him back to slavery in Alexandria. And as you might imagine, the Quaker community of Nantucket's having nothing to do with it. And he ends up, her family ends up, helping him to evade this slave catcher. So thinking about how these different conceptions of freedom and people, who are thrown in different parts of the world because of different conceptions of liberty come together, and an inspiring story of community resistance to, people trying to snatch people away from their homes and families.
It's a great story. It's another Forrest Gump story, but it's going to be extraordinary. And it should be a movie. So you will write it, and then someone will make the movie. There's a last question here that I think is perfect for where we are. Steve wanted to know, how can museums and historic places help us reassess how artists played a role in the American Revolution? And I would amend that slightly to say, why are museums and historic places essential to understanding the American Revolution?
I love that question too. And I think one of the things that I was reminded of forcefully while researching and writing this book is that art is powerful. And there's a reason that people have emotional responses to art and make art fueled by emotion. And I think that you also don't have revolution without emotion. I think especially when we talk about the American Revolution, we talk a lot about natural rights and, John Locke and all these things that are really important. But I don't think most people go and pick up a musket because, they've read Montesquieu, right? I think you need like something else to sort of get you going. And so I think art is one of those things that rallies people and inspires people. And the other thing about art is that it's easily replicated. So like Robert Edge Pine's portrait of John Wilkes was made into a print that circulated around the British Empire. And so all these people could see the portrait of John Wilkes, who was imprisoned without due process and without habeas corpus being served. And they could be like, this is wrong and this shouldn't happen. And they could look at the print and be inspired in ways that, maybe they wouldn't pick up a newspaper and read about it in the same way. And I think also that thinking about how, again, we live in a material world, and thinking about the power that material and visual things have to shape our emotions and our realities, I think we need to remember that. This is part of what shapes who we are. And then last but not least, I think that we should go to museums to think about the revolution in two ways. And one is to acknowledge the work that museums do as cultural institutions to help to tell the stories of our past in really important ways. When you go to a museum exhibition and you see a portrait on the wall, it's not just there randomly, right? It's very carefully thought of, and the exhibition label is probably agonized over by multiple people, not just one. I know Mount Vernon staff can feel that probably, right? But that these are things that are just like a history book chooses which documents, a museum chooses which objects are narrating a story. And they're doing important work preserving those stories, but also to remember what falls between the cracks and what's not there. So like in the case of Robert Edge Pine and Patience Wright, their art ends up through a weird chance of fate in the hands of this guy called Daniel Bowen, who operates a museum in Boston. So his paintings, her wax figures, are in this same museum, which goes up in flames in the 19th century. So I think it's important too when you're at a museum to say, what's not in this museum? And what is not on display? And who is not represented and why? And one of the reasons the Nantucket Whaling Museum got me thinking about that story was that the exhibit of their portraits, periodically they have blank frames. So, frames without a picture inside of it. And they say, here's where a picture of this person who was important on Nantucket but wasn't wealthy enough to have a portrait done should be. And I thought that's such an effective way to remind people that there are gaps in what we see. And so, think about what's there and thank the people who preserve it, but also think of what's not there and why are those silences there and what can we do about it?
Such a great reminder. We are going to end there. Zara's book is available for sale out in the lobby. I will not insist, but I will highly pressure you all to go buy a copy. We are going to sneak out the side, and she will meet you all out in the lobby where you can sing her praises and get her to sign a book for you all. Please join me in thanking Zara for being here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. It's fun.